So I'm going to get started. That sound good, Dylan? All right. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to Data Isn't Enough, Community Knowledge, Visualization, and the Challenges of Science Communication. This is the first of our 2026 webinar series focused on the theme of practicing integration, interdisciplinary research, and integrative studies in action. I'm Tal Beery, Executive Director of the Wright-Ingraham Institute, and in just a moment, I'll introduce Dylan Gauthier, who's our Director of Research and Publications, who will introduce the event, introduce our speakers, and moderate the discussion. So housekeeping first, as always with webinars, just keep yourselves muted. The webinar is being recorded and transcribed, so we'll be able to save and share this event forever and ever. And I'm sure it's going to be a great event, so we're going to want to share it a whole bunch. And one disclaimer, when we sent out the invitation to this event, we got suggestions from a few of you to correct the event title. Data is plural, and so the event should be called Data Aren't Enough. Now, we here at the Wright-Ingraham Institute care deeply about English grammar, and I think it's worth addressing this grammar dispute as it might be relevant to the topic of today's conversation. Because, of course, the word data is plural. It comes directly from Latin. The singular of data is datum. But in the United States, at least, the language has evolved in recent years to reflect how we view information in the computer age. So when managing billions of rows of bytes, big data, as it were, we've begun to see data as a unified single entity rather than a collection of distinct and countable facts. And perhaps this reflects an information ecosystem that's ultimately less intelligible to us. Or the flip side might also be true, reflecting the ubiquity of data today and its deep intrinsic connection with our daily lives. So either way, I've appreciated the feedback from folks in our community, and this has been an interesting question to reflect on over this last week. And so, yeah, if you have any questions or concerns about our titles in the future, please do email us. It's always fun. Two other quick intros. The Wright-Ingraham Institute, we generate new insights and strategies for environmental stewardship and resilience by connecting scientific, cultural, and locally held knowledge. Through place-based integrative studies, so research and education focused on land and water challenges, we build shared understanding and promote collaborative action to help people and landscapes thrive. This webinar series is one of the ways in which we connect people with our work. This summer, we're running a fellowship program in Colorado and New Mexico focused on systems adaptation in a time of prolonged drought. We're also in the process of developing a number of exciting research initiatives. We'll be putting links to those upcoming programs in the chat. So if you'd like to read more about that, about what we've been up to lately, you can click on those links, and we'll also put a link to our recently released annual report, which is beautiful, designed by Frida Foberg, another member of our team, and please do read it. And finally, we're currently in the midst of a fundraising campaign, the goal of which is to reach 100 donors by July 3rd. Donations can be of any size, and this whole campaign is about engagement and participation. Some of you have already given, but we will put the link to the campaign in the chat as well. And we would deeply appreciate your support as we ramp up to a very exciting and consequential summer programming season. It's my pleasure to introduce our Director of Research and Publications, Dylan Gauthier. Dylan is an artist, curator, designer, and educator whose various projects over decades have investigated the relationships between ecology, architecture, landscape, collaboration, and social change. He's had projects at the Centre Pompidou, Harvard University, the Parrish Art Museum, the Walker Art Center, and plenty of other venues globally. He's a very curious, careful, and deep thinker, and a truly excellent person to be leading this conversation. So thank you very much, and take it away, Dylan.
Wow, thank you so much, Tal. That was such a nice intro and personal intro. So thank you. I'm Dylan Gauthier, Director of Research for Wright-Ingraham Institute. And before we begin, I want to just open with a land acknowledgement to acknowledge that this gathering today spans both occupied and unceded lands. And those of us joining from New York City are on Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Munsee Lenape people, whose name for this place means land. Those of us joining from Colorado are on the traditional unceded territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples among the many indigenous tribes and nations who have historically called Colorado home. Over 40 different indigenous nations continue to be in relation with those lands. We honor the elders and knowledge keepers of these nations, past, present, and future. And the ecological knowledge they've cultivated and protected across generations is inseparable from the landscapes we study and care for and the work that we do carries that recognition at the Wright-Ingraham Institute. So thank you all. I just want to say if you would like to introduce yourself in the chat, that'd be great. We're asking that you stay muted until the second half of our program when we'll be opening it up for discussion, audience Q&A. But just another quick housekeeping thing. So we're going to hear from each of our speakers today for about 20 minutes each, followed by time for reflection and your responses, and hopefully a conversation that could go on until I think 2:30 is our kind of end time today. But we ask you to hold your questions until the end, but feel free to queue them up in the chat during the speakers' presentations as you are moved to do so. We are recording this Zoom webinar. We'll be sending out a link to the video and a transcription next week as part of our Nexus newsletter, which if you are not formally already subscribed to our Nexus newsletter, you will be, and feel free to decline or opt out if you don't want the emails, but that'll be the first one coming to you next Wednesday. As Tal said, this is the first of 4 events in our 26-27 series, Practicing Integration, Interdisciplinary Research and Integrative Studies in Action. The Institute's approach to integrative studies begins with this conviction that the most urgent environmental and social challenges don't live neatly inside disciplinary boundaries. They're at the interfaces and intersections between ecology and culture, infrastructure and memory, technical possibility and community capacity. And that is what we're going to be addressing today. We believe that addressing the key issues and problems of our day requires not just better science, but better communication. Here we are operating in this backdrop, which I just wrote about on our Substack, of public trust in scientific institutions being at, if not an all-time low, at least a record low. Questions about who produces knowledge, for whom, in what form, what tools we use to derive that knowledge have become highly politicized and polarized. Policy debates, community disputes, and funding battles that we see playing out today in real time. At the same time, the environmental data or datum has never been more abundant. Satellite imagery, sensor networks, open source data sets, AI modeling. These tools give us real-time dashboards that lay users and citizen scientists can, in theory, access, right? So what can we understand from these disjunctures? Today, communities that are faced with drought, wildfire, displacement, ecological change may struggle to connect the data to their own decisions and realities. And again, this gap isn't technical, but a problem of epistemology, narrative, communications, and trust. So in many ways, we see that the abundance of data from so many sources has made things less clear. What data do we trust? How do we connect that data with communities? And again, this is why we are gathered today to hear from 2 really inspiring, I was going to say, experts in this field. And I will say also that these are, really exciting to have both Kim Fewless from NCAR. Kim is a scientist with National Science Foundation's National Center for Atmospheric Research, along with Matthew Ross, who's the faculty director of the Geospatial Centroid at Colorado State University, and will tell us about his lab there. We're going to hear from Kim first, followed by Matt, and I asked them both to introduce themselves because I figured they would do a better job of doing it than if I were to read their bios, but we also do have their bios on the website, and I'll post that along with the video and the follow-up email that goes out for anybody who misses it. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us today, and thanks Kim and Matt for being here. I will turn off my slides and mute myself and hand the mic over to Kimberly Fewless.
Says my screen sharing is paused. Is that right? Or do you guys have it? Hold on just one sec.
Sorry, it did look paused. It looked like it was preparing and then it was a black screen, but I'm sure it will work in a second.
Let me do it one more time. Apologies. Are we there?
We are there. There they are. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your patience. It's great to be here. I always have trouble when I can't see everyone, but I'll do my best talking to my own screen, and I look forward to your questions at the end. So, as Dylan said, my name is Kim. I am a scientist at the National Science Foundation National Center for Atmospheric Research. Within that organization, I am situated in the Research Applications Lab. And within the Research Applications Lab, I'm in the Environmental Resilience Applications Program. This year, I'm also the UCAR President's Leadership Fellow. UCAR is the University Consortium for Atmospheric Research, and it's our managing entity. In addition to INCAR, we have a University Communities program that's under that umbrella of UCAR. So that's why it gets confusing for folks when they see INCAR and UCAR. What are you? But that's all it is. Today, I'll be sharing both my pathway to this work and then my current experiences in conducting convergence, actionable, and translational research at INCAR. And although INCAR's breadth of research is pretty broad, a lot of my work is in the water space. Yeah, as an overview for this presentation, a little bit of background, a little bit of introduction to INCAR's work. I'm going to provide some definitions which hopefully are insightful, but at the very least will give you my perspective on the terms actionable, translational, and convergence research. And I hope that the lessons learned that I share are insightful. I was playing with Google Gemini for a different project and created this image of mapping out how we get from ideas to actual operational implication. And the point here is not to look at every little detail on this map, but I'm going to use this to draw a metaphor to hiking or mountaineering in general. So I feel like when you're in this space of community engaged research, stakeholder informed research, convergence research, where you're spanning boundaries, getting people to talk together that don't get together and collaborate and talk that don't necessarily do that on a regular basis, a lot of insights happen on the journey. So just the journey is important as the destination. However, the tools matter, your trusted adventure buddies matter, and your attitude matters. And I'll bring that back in at the end, but that's my framing for today. So my journey to this work at INCAR, where I'm essentially a boundary spanner, I have about a decade of my early career as a professional cellist that really gave me an orientation early on towards collaboration, towards empathy, gave me a very healthy dose. Those of you in the arts know this of grit building and people skills. That's not an insignificant part of my life and how I ended up who I am. I moved over to engineering, which was solutions focused, and that's really important that I had that early training in that sort of solutions focused, team centered, innovative lens on things. Because entering then a scientific organization like INCAR, like I'm always primed towards thinking about the applications of the work that we do. I've had tremendous training and mentors over the years, just really engaged faculty, folks that were flying airplanes up and down the Front Range to get air quality measurements from some of the oil and gas operations that are occurring, folks working with the city of Denver around aquifer storage and recharge or groundwater contamination, just really interesting projects throughout my education experience. My PhD training was in the National Science Foundation Interviews program, which is interdisciplinary training, education, and research in food, energy, water systems. I also spent a year as a PhD student in atmospheric science. So I have the lens of water resources and engineering and also atmospheric science. And throughout the interviews program and my work at INCAR, I've also been able to get some training in social science methods. So this has all really set me up for what I'm doing today. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, I've had a lot of opportunities for interdisciplinary and practitioner-informed work throughout those experiences and through working for the Colorado Water Conservation Board prior to INCAR. And the fun part for me is now I'm having the chance to pull together all those and all that knowledge and all those skill sets for the work that I do. Okay, so INCAR has a deep history, decades of history, and a large number of people involved in that history of community engagement, co-production, trust building, narrative development, and actionable and translational research. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but that's the QR code for our current strategic plan. We have goals to understand Earth system processes by investigating interdisciplinary and complex systems, empowering the scientific community through model improvement and community contributions, and supporting societal resilience by tackling critical societal problems, partnering with end users, and creating community. And this backdrop is really important for supporting the work that I'm doing. In the research applications lab, the center square there is all the areas of work that all the sectors that we're involved in. And I'll talk about the GIS program in just a moment, but it really spans a multitude of weather and climate hazard related areas, but also just general Earth systems change. I love this quote from an early INCAR director. I have a very strong feeling that science exists to serve human betterment and improve human welfare. And maybe I'll say Earth systems welfare, not just humans, but that really embodies the spirit of the research applications lab. And I'm actually in the Geographic Information Systems program, but I am not a GIS person. I just support the actionable science that they do within that program. But I'm offering this QR code because the breadth of research that's happening there is profound and inspiring. Okay, so now I'm going to move into some examples of convergence and of actionable and translational research that I'm involved in at NCAR. So under the convergence umbrella, this is thinking about integration across institutions, disciplines, and communities. And in the actionable and translational research, this I'm going to try to bring in the elements of not only translation, but trust and narratives or communication to address gaps between scientific knowledge and the communities who need it. And I have to note here that this is ongoing collaboratory work. Some of it's being prepared for publication, but I ask that you don't copy distribute. I didn't put this on every slide without express consent because it is still in progress. So here's my just getting us all on the same page. And also just sharing how I think about this. So what is actionable? I think about that as being, and I'll say this is widely adopted across the literature. This is not just me, but thinking about research that is useful, usable, and used. So useful, providing information that's needed. Usable, can it be incorporated in decision making? And used, is it accessible? Is it open? Is it transparent? Is it known? Is it consistent? And all of these elements require understanding the decision-making context, who the decision makers are, what those decisions are, what is the associated risk, where are there boundaries or challenges for uptaking new information. So it's actually a very deep thing to understand what is actionable, even though I've just thrown 3 words up here. And then for translational, how I think about that is that for the insights of research to be applied, it needs to be able to be translated into tangible solutions. And then convergence. This sort of, in my mind, is a necessary element in the face of today's current challenges that are so vexing. It's like we also need this convergence piece of integrating knowledge across different domains and different perspectives. It's like one step beyond actionable and translational in my mind. Okay, I'm also going to share the National Science Foundation definition of convergence here. Forgive the number of words on the slide, but it's important. Convergence research is a means of solving vexing research problems, especially those focusing on societal needs, driven by specific and compelling problems. So that can be a deep scientific question or a pressing societal need. It shows really deep integration across disciplines. And it intentionally brings together intellectually diverse researchers, and you can expand that beyond just researchers to develop effective ways of communicating across disciplines. And the shared language piece is really important, and the trust piece that has to happen there and the sort of psychological safety that has to happen there is really important. And the idea is that as you bring these folks together and you do it deeply and you do it early on and you do it with a lot of intentionality, that knowledge, theories, methods, data, research communities just increasingly intermingle to the point that new frameworks, paradigms, or even disciplines can emerge. And that's the QR code there for the NSF website for this. Why am I not progressing? There we go. Okay. At INCAR, we have a convergent science program, and I'm an ambassador for that program for the Research Applications Lab. And let me go back real quick. Julie DeMuth, who is our lead at that program, has taken not only the NSF definition of convergence, but also looked at the body of literature that's starting to define what convergence looks like and how we can measure it and how we can assess it, and has come up with 4 kind of basic elements, all of which should be present in a convergence research endeavor. It needs to be problem driven. That's the why. It's driven by a complex, important scientific or societal problem. The who is that it involves people from widely varying expertise. The how is that the team works together closely and regularly to co-develop and blend their ideas, knowledge, and practices. This is distinct from, for example, having an engineering project and bringing a social scientist in at the end to check the box of that. And then the novel outcomes is the what. It generates new, innovative ways of thinking past solutions and other outcomes that are not possible otherwise. And like I said, to make convergence distinct from interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, it's really having all of these elements to have convergence move forward. Okay. I'm going to move on to my first example, and this is really about actionable science. We have at INCAR, we have many products. This is one of them. It's called NA Cortex. It's a 12-kilometer dynamically downscaled, and that's different than statistically downscaled, climate simulations over all of North America. And these simulations from this data set span from 1950 to 2100. It involved downscaling 5 to 6 CMIP6 GCMs, global climate models, and 2 climate scenarios, which are different projections of how Earth systems change will play out based on a number of different factors. This is the website for that data. This project, the NA Cortex and the Cortex project, has been going on for a long time. And Seth McGinnis and Linda Mearns have been involved in trying to make this sort of data set actionable for quite a while. So I've cited their paper there. So we are continuing progress towards making this data actionable. And the challenges and opportunities we really have in this space are what and who. So what climate variables, what thresholds are folks looking at? How are they incorporating into this decisions or not, or might be? And how can we offer this information in a way that makes it more useful and usable? And this is a really complex space to be a national center attempting to do this on broad scale when there are different needs, capacities, and capabilities, yet the value of offering this information along with quantification of uncertainty and discussions of how it should or should not be used is really potentially critical. And I'll say this process is requiring great amount of curiosity and thoughtfulness and iteration. It's also important to think about reciprocation when you're engaging with stakeholders to figure out how to make this information more actionable. Trust and respect is huge. Transparency in how we've created this data, what the uncertainty is, etc. And just the time to set this up so that it can be a consistent source of information and not just a single project. Another project I'm involved in is called Water Squared, which stands for Water Workshops to Accelerate Translational Earth Systems Research. And in this project, I'm bringing together water managers across all of the Upper Colorado River Basin states. This is actually next week, alongside a lot of boundary organizations in this space, federal agencies, and in-car researchers. And a lot of the intent here is around partnership building and trust. And that means that I'm working hard to facilitate deepening understanding of both the research state of the science and challenges and context there, but also the decision-making needs and context. So I'm spending a lot of time, or I did spend a lot of time co-creating the content of the 2 virtual meetings we did for this and the 2-day in-person workshop. So working with my stakeholders at the state agencies, or my partners, I should say, at the state agencies, to think about what do we want to get out of this? How can we continue this conversation? What's important to you to learn about or to focus on? What are you interested in learning about on the in-car side? Yeah, I would say this has been a communication challenge way more than a technical challenge for me in getting this workshop together. And this is just an example of the types of topics we're talking about in that workshop. These are things that folks brought up as needs. And you can see things like observations and data and snow to flow and runoff efficiency and predictability and limits and causality of predictability and subseasonal to seasonal skill, things like that. But what you also see is usability and usefulness. And I didn't put that in there. These are practitioners. The what and how of research to operations to research, communication, funding, alternatives to probabilistic methods, things that require far more thoughtfulness and integration, integrative, collaborative work together than just creating data and putting it out there. And the last thing I'll share about is some convergence research that I'm involved in, focused on water systems resilience. And this is motivated by the fact that Earth systems and hydrologic change and increased human demand for water are increasingly impacting water systems sustainability and resilience. And a more integrative understanding of water availability and use under Earth systems change is critical for water management and planning. So the challenge here is that really focused lines of scientific inquiry sometimes miss really important drivers. So we want to just blow up the borders on the problem, for lack of a better way of putting that, to see if we could develop some innovative insights or some different approaches for tackling this beyond just modeling every detail of the system. You have to draw some kind of border around it because of computational complexity, but this was the idea here. So we put together a workshop last fall that brought together a whole lot of researchers spanning policy, economics, earth systems modeling, water use data, and I'll show you the figure that kind of sums up the folks that were in the room. And that's spun off into its own webinar series, and we're developing a convergence framework that's in preparation for publication. Hopefully, we're submitting to Water Resources Research. I'm hoping it'll get published later this year. Oh, I've already said that. And here's the figure. So the idea is if you bring folks together that are involved in modeling, you bring folks together that are really knowledgeable about water use data, the human side of water budgets, and you bring together decision makers, what happens at these intersections of these communities of practice and their respective knowledge? And what the convergence framework is really going to bring together is this central piece. What happens when all of these things collide? What ideas come out? And we've already had we have some really fun insights laid out that I'm looking forward to sharing in the publication. So just briefly, my takeaways here, coming back to our hiking metaphor, the journey is the destination. Insights for me on these projects have occurred throughout collaboration and engagement. It's not the last model run that gives me the insight I need. Often it's serendipitous conversation from having a conversation with a practitioner or some other boundary organization along the way. I'm going to emphasize the importance of social science expertise in terms of tools matter for these outdoor adventures. Shared knowledge is really important. Having folks that can span boundaries is really important. Again, adventure buddies are critical. We can't know everything. Trust is key. Attitude is paramount. Really want to emphasize that a lot of what I bring to these projects is curiosity and deep listening in conversation and in learning. I've had to drop some preconceived ideas when somebody brings in a new perspective, and that's helped me continue to grow in this space and stay humble. Respect and trust, patience. This kind of work is very messy. Related to that, remain flexible and attentive. This is for hiking and in these projects. So one of the key things here, and I'm going to point to this Sundstrom et al. Paper 2020, they talk about convergent science as a zooming in, zooming out. We're creating focused scientific inquiries, but we're facilitating transcendent spaces for ideation as well. And you almost want to start with the transcendent space, blow off the boundaries, and then you can find areas for more focused scientific inquiry, but it's informed by a broader view. Yeah, and then I guess the other piece here is that this kind of work tends to be problem oriented, not oriented towards we're going to use a specific tool or a method. So if there is a destination, that's what I would call it, is addressing this key challenge. And that's what I have for today. I'm sorry, it looks like I went a couple minutes over. Sorry about that, Dylan. Ooh.
Fantastic intro and getting us all on the same footing here while we queue up Matt Ross. We'll hear from him in a minute. I'm just putting back in the chat. And if you haven't introduced yourself in the chat, feel free to do so. Thank you so much, Kim. And go ahead, Matt. And hold your questions, but feel free to put questions or comments in the chat as we go. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And that was an amazing intro, Kim. Now, of course, I'm struggling. Go away, Zoom bar. Been 7 years of doing this, still don't remember always how to get that out of there. Anyways, yeah, so my name is Matt Ross, and I'm an associate professor at Colorado State University in Watershed Sciences, and I'm also the faculty director of the Geospatial Centroid. And I'd say between those two units, 70 to 80% of our work is this sort of convergent or stakeholder-driven science, where we're really trying to build tools instead of sort of basic science discovery, although those often go hand in hand, as Kim was mentioning. So I just want to talk a little bit about myself and how I got here, and then the particular lens I bring to this work, which is actually more of a design lens than it is specific to convergence research. So let's get started. Just to back way up, I got my PhD at Duke University, where I studied the impacts of mountaintop mining on water quality in rivers downstream of mining. This is what mining looks like. And when you work on a project like this, it's fairly easy to start thinking that most of the whole world is a designed process, not necessarily a natural process anymore. So obviously this is an extreme version of a built environment, but even our natural areas that are protected, that is actually an active process. It's not a passive thing where nature is left alone to do its own thing. We actually have to exert energy to protect these areas to allow some kind of natural process to go on, even while climate change and nutrient pollution and all those things are global changes. So working here for the 6 years that I did, that really affected how I think about what I wanted to do in my life. And I wanted to work in this space where we all admit that we're constantly building the world, and maybe we can do that in ways that protect the world and ourselves better. So that was my main motivation. And I started this as an undergraduate at CU Boulder, actually, in ecology. So I was really focused, if you look at this image, on the trees in my undergraduate degree. But as I worked in this area, the biggest impacts were really propagated through water. So this is me crossing a bridge. So I'm standing about 9 feet above the regular river height. Dangerous, idiotic thing to do as a 24-year-old. But that's one of these rivers in West Virginia. And just when you're working in this setting, it's so obvious that the main impacts are local, of course, where the mines are, but then they propagate 10 to hundreds of miles downstream. And so I got focused a little bit more on how these built ecosystems, this built earth really in this setting was impacting water quality downstream. And there, one of the frustrating things about my PhD is I was essentially a passive observer. I was really documenting this impact, and I wasn't really driving much decisions. I wrote a lot of papers and had some nice press coverage of my work, but it was really just these out-of-the-loop critiques of a process that we're extracting coal from this landscape, and is it really worth it to destroy it at this level? But I wasn't a part of the legislative process controlling that or focus much on that. So as I went further in my career, I really wanted to do work where I was in the loop, in the design loop, and really focus on how to make a change. And that's where a lot of this stakeholder-driven work has become a pillar of what my lab does. And I should say, when I talk, I will say I a lot just because of the nature of this, but really I run a large team of more than 15 staff and graduate students, and they're really the ones driving a lot of this work. So if you take a step back, one thing my lab and I refer to a lot is this quote from a landscape architect, actually, John Tillman Lyle. And he has this quote that's my core career motivation, which is that the point is that if we're going to design ecosystems, and we continually do so, whether we care to face all the implications or not, then it will be the best to design them intentionally, making use of all the ecological understanding we can bring to bear. And I like this image of this national park in New Zealand because it shows this idea that even a very natural area is actually an unnatural cutout of all this agriculture going around the outside. And so I think that gets at what John Tillman Lyle's quote is about, which is just even our natural areas take this work to protect them and to have a process. And we should use all this ecological understanding we can to do a better job making decisions about the environment, which of course, in my case, is mostly in the water sector. So those ideas come from this paper I wrote in 2015 that was about designer systems, which is just that if we start with the premise that most of the earth is directly controlled by people, a large solution space that we've pursued for a long time has been this idea of restoration and other ideas that are, let's give nature a chance to go back to its prior state, and that will emergent goals will come from that: cleaner water quality, more resilient to fire, et cetera, et cetera. And in this paper, we outline this idea that that's a noble idea, but if we don't let things evolve and we don't let them evolve towards a goal, we will end up failing, because without declaring a goal for a restoration process, we may not be able to measure whether or not we were successful. And so in the top are classic design. This is the Eames chair, and of course this is the iPhone. But then we have stormwater design is the third layer there, C. And then D is the Los Angeles River, which is one of these areas where it was a natural river, but then it was completely turned into a concrete pipeline, essentially. That's in the middle 1999 view. But now part of it they're actually reclaiming, and they're not doing it with this sort of notion of, oh, it's a pure restoration. The river's not running free, but parts of it are more wild. So this is much more in a design framework where, hey, this is a totally unnatural river, but we can still get a lot of value out of it. And I was there several years ago and saw a person fly fishing down there. So even in this really unnatural environment, you can pursue natural recreation. And part of the goal here was just that in restoration broadly, often goals are not ever even defined, so you can't evaluate them. And so there's a whole bunch of different ways to think about a design process. I like NASA's quite a bit, which because it starts with identify the problem, which relates to stakeholder engagement again. But you can kind of read these. They all are very similar. So you have software development, open standards for conservation, NASA design, and then the general design goal, which is that you got to define your goals, identify the constraints, and design a solution, and then monitor, evaluate, and iterate. These don't necessarily center the human part, but of course, each one of these has a lot of human input. Where what is our goal when we're doing this intervention on our watershed or preventing wildfire or whatever our goal is? How are we going to get there? What are we going to do on the landscape? And how are we going to evaluate if we're successful or not? So this sort of idea is a major way that we think about our work in my lab. And I'm just going to step through a couple examples of what we do and how we try to get it done. And I'd also like to start by saying, like, I have this strong motivation to build things that are useful, but I fail in that constantly. So I have built many data sets that I have learned that if you just build these things, only your friends will come. So people in your network will use the things you build, but people outside of your network, it's very hard to build awareness. So I've built global remote sensing products, global small watershed ecosystem projects, global microbial databases, and small Colorado-based projects. And while all of these this is of course Gemini generated, and because you can always tell when something's an AI, but the citations are real. And while those sort of seem a reasonably successful series of citations, that's actually far less than I had hoped for these papers that have been out there for a long time. And that's of course probably just early career naivete in some ways, but I also think it's just the outreach to get things to actually be used costs vastly more time than the time it takes to make those things. And so that's like a huge part of the redesign of some of the way our lab's working now, is instead of just making these big data sets and shoving them out into the world, hoping people will use them, we're doing a lot more outreach to make sure that communities use them. And I'll talk about some specific examples. There was a stage in my career where I just thought through artistry and data visualization, we could overcome this. So I'll just describe one of those data sets. This is Aquasat. What you're seeing here with the sort of like bar outlines is when one of the Landsat satellites crosses over a river or lake that's visible to Landsat. So when they turn cyan, Landsat saw those rivers. And from that, we can often detect water quality. But if we want to do that, we need to build algorithms that have someone in the field was already measuring a water quality parameter, like how much sediment is in there, how much algae is in there, how much total organic carbon, which you can imagine is like when you make tea, that's what you're making. So I made this data set called Aquasat. And what's happening here is all the colored dots are flashing when someone was randomly in the field taking a regulatory sample for water quality. Because in the United States, we have a ton of regulations, the Clean Water Act, around water quality, and we go collect water quality data all the time. But what's flashing in white is when randomly a Landsat satellite passed over on the exact same day. And so those two things together build what we call a training data set or a label data set in machine learning, and they allow us to use remote sensing of water quality. And I thought building this data set in 2018 when I first built it, that this would be a revolution in science. Again, probably half of that's naivete, but I also think that I didn't do a great job doing outreach and tutorials and teaching people how to use this. Certainly not in the science community, I didn't do that. But if you want to go to the practitioner community, that takes even more effort, which we have funding now that we're doing a lot more of that. But just building this and building a cool YouTube video, that doesn't really do much. That took me a week to make, and it has 600 views on YouTube. So it's not like it was some overwhelming success. And so from those broad sort of grandiose goals, I have narrowed my work a lot to be much more local. So I like this silly map of the Upper Cashfloputer watershed where I live and work. So if you see the little star down here, that's Fort Collins in the bottom right there. And then this river, the Cashfloputer River, is a heavily used river for drinking water supply, agriculture, and then of course what's highlighted here is a lot of recreation. So this is a really common Western river. It's got a bunch of reservoirs upstream. It's got a bunch of water users that are a mix of agriculture, industrial, municipal, and then it has a ton of recreation on it as well. And so this river has just a bunch of demands on how it's used. And when I got here, I wanted to have part of my lab build things that were directly useful to the cities who use this river. So right now on this map, City of Fort Collins is highlighted, but we also work with City of Greeley, which is nearby, City of Thornton, which is a new player in the basin because they have a new water they have, and Soldier Canyon Authority, which is all the outlying suburban areas, and then Northern Water, which is a large regional water supplier. And our goal here, when we started this project, that I came up with on my own, was just like, hey, let's see if we can improve drinking water treatment plant operations with real-time and forecasted water quality data. So I build models and use machine learning to predict water quality, and I thought, oh, these water treatment plants definitely need what I have. And I would say that initially that was more like, I have a solution, here it is. And despite all of my prior research on the design process, I didn't do much to ask them what they needed. So I wrote a bunch of grants and some of them got funded, and I started to build solutions that were probably done with a lack of humility, where I just was like, oh, here are the problems that I perceive, because they were interesting in the literature. A big one throughout the United States right now is a huge growth in the perceived threat of algae blooms on drinking water supply. So that was an area that we wanted to work. And I was like, we can do remote sensing of algae blooms and all your reservoirs, and let's do this, that, and this. And then I finally talked to many of my collaborators at the water treatment plants. These are the folks that actually manage the drinking water. And they were like, we don't need any of that. Let's do something else. So we started to have hundreds of hours of meetings with our partners out here. And that's over the last 8 or 9 years. And we just did a ton of stakeholder engagement and community building. And I'll be clear here, I think there are various layers of stakeholder engagement. My lab does all of them. But what I'm talking about here is stakeholder engagement to treatment plant operators. It is not really to the community, as in the people who live on the river. It is really to people who work at the treatment plant. Water treatment plants are fascinating places. Usually the people who run them are often PhD level watershed scientists or chemists, but the people operating them are often GED level folks who maybe are finishing their high school degree. So there's a huge range of sort of background education at the actual treatment plant. And so we spend a lot of time teaching folks about novel technologies that are potentially could be integrated into water treatment plant operations. These are two of my staff members, Juan and Sam, giving us we do bike tours along where we measure our water quality. And the goal here is really to build understanding from the treatment plant operators. What can we do with these new technologies and new forecasting methods? And so we did that a bunch. We also did a bunch of the other side, direct community outreach. Our watershed had a big fire. And so we had a large art and science event that we hosted to see what the community perceived as threats post-fire. So this was like a painting that was a community-drawn painting that everyone got to participate. And then we did a bunch of surveys of what the community thought about. It ended up being that was largely, we have other grants that I'm not going to talk about here, that largely that the need there was an educational need. So we have some art and science projects that are focused on educating the community for those. And the actionable science that we found was really this work at the water treatment plant, but not work on algae. It was really work on disinfectant byproduct formation. So total organic carbon, which if you've ever made tea or coffee, what you're drinking is total organic carbon. You're drinking dissolved carbon or particulate carbon that has complex shapes and interacts in a complex way with chlorine when we do water treatment that can form carcinogenic, cancer-causing compounds. And so all water treatment plants in the country monitor TOC at the treatment plant to make sure they're making good decisions about how much total organic carbon is in the water, and then therefore how much chlorine do they need to add to make sure that they are killing the bacteria and not just making a bunch of cancer-causing compounds. So that was the feedback we got. It was an area of research that I was not focused on before meeting with our collaborators. And so what we've built is a series of tools that help the operators make decisions about what they're doing. So these are real-time total organic carbon forecasts, and they're deployed across the upper Cache-la-Poudre watershed, and they monitor a whole bunch of water quality parameters. And then we build a model that essentially takes all that data and provides them with real-time understanding of where the water quality threats are coming from. And in our river, it takes about 24 hours from our most upstream sensor to reach the treatment plant. So this real-time system gives them a 12 to 24-hour warning if there's a whole bunch of poor water quality that's about to reach the treatment plant. They also indicated that they would like a 7-day forecast because here, like in much of the Western US, there is a mix of reservoir water supply and river water supply. And so they get to make choices. All right, the river's cranking, there's too much sediment in the river. We're going to switch over to the reservoir as our primary drinking water source. But when they do that, they're interacting with Western water law of who's allowed to have that water at this exact moment. Is your water right first in line here? And so in our case, most of our providers would prefer to take water off of the Poudre River because they have more senior rights on the river and they have less senior rights on the reservoirs. And so if we could give them a forecast, their water rights supply team can actually make a longer term prediction of, oh, in 8 days, our forecast doesn't go out that long. In 2 days, there's going to be a 2C spike because of a rainstorm coming in. So we need to switch to Horsetooth then. Are we good? Are we in the correct water rights line? So we learned a ton about this. This was all stuff I didn't know before meeting with our partners. And I should just say our partners span like 6 different departments at the cities of Fort Collins and Greeley. So just finding who to talk to is a long journey, and we're still meeting new people who could use this stuff. So we're predicting total organic carbon at the intake, and it's a probabilistic forecasting model, and it just predicts it using a bunch of different products, basically weather and snow melt products. And after a bunch of design, I'll just show you a quick video of how we use this tool. So basically, what a water provider would do is they would open this data portal up, and at the bottom, it'll immediately show them the forecast for total organic carbon over the coming weeks. We're at around peak snowmelt right now. Here, as snowmelt declines, the total organic carbon concentration declines. So it's actually easier to treat the water here later in summer. And so what this is doing is this shows a map. The end user can zoom around and grab different sites and immediately look at the forecast. While they're looking at the forecast, they can say initialize data to look at all the other data. This takes a while. This is getting telemetered live. This is not a live demo. This was yesterday, but it's showing these sort of the data, and they can just kind of wait. And this is not super sophisticated because these folks at the treatment plant are already using dashboards that look a lot like this. So we just built our dashboard based on what they already use. And they asked us to keep it out of their other dashboard. They wanted this to be completely separate. And so that's what we did. And so here they can look at different time series of the various water quality data that we collect. Turbidity is a major one. That's a major decision point that we collect in real time for them. So they can also see that one. And then at the bottom here, we're going to show the model of our real-time estimate. So the previous one was a 7-day forecast. That last one at the bottom there that zoomed past was a real-time estimate of all the different sites. And then as we worked with our partners, we learned that they wanted more things. So they also wanted basin conditions. So what's going on in the basin compared to previous years? And is there a reservoir release? So that we built this other dashboard, which is not actually our data, it's other people's data, but it just shows in the black line there is this year's discharge. If you don't know, Colorado had one of its driest years ever, saved a tiny bit by May being quite wet. And so you can see that in the data. We had a peak of discharge, some of the earliest we've ever seen in the record, which was like in March. And then a decline, it was declining all the way. And then we got a bunch of late snow, thank God. And that helped. And so the water treatment operators are watching this very closely, and the water supply planners. And so this dashboard was built directly with their feedback. And this year we're collecting data on how they're using it and what to improve. So this is just a fully integrated feedback loop, and we're really close with all of the various operators, and we just continue to grow this sort of decision support systems very specifically. I wasn't sure how much time I would have, so I have another example, but I'm going to skip over it because I don't want to run over. But we know that this work is not just local. So as I mentioned, City of Fort Collins depends not only on the Poudre River, but also on Horsetooth Reservoir. Where does the water come from Horsetooth Reservoir? It comes from Northern Water and the Colorado Big Thompson project, where they pump water across the divide. So we also have another linked project where we're predicting the impact of pumping operations on these lakes to better understand when Front Range, Eastern Slope folks call on their water, what are the impacts on the lakes on the western slope, and how can we mitigate those impacts, if at all, in different climate years? So Horsetooth Reservoir up here near Fort Collins, that's our secondary water supply. And it's about 50-50 mix in our city. So we're trying to predict the whole network. And it's a very complex thing because this work is not actually with the city of Fort Collins, it's with Northern Water, a completely different entity that manages all of these trans-basin diversions. So just I think that work just highlights that this interdisciplinary work just requires a ton of relationship building and time spent with other people. And so, yeah, just the quick summary, ecosystem design or ecosystem management is not just about physical landscapes, it's about the information phrases we use to manage them and the relationships we build. Modeling actually is secondary if decision makers cannot trust or interpret the output. So we spend a lot of time trying to teach folks about what machine learning means, when it's appropriate, when it's inappropriate, how to use it. And then we did a ton of co-designing with operators. And I don't know why this is in weird green, but just need to build this epistemological bridge needed for action. And I'm happy to talk about some of our other projects, which I just didn't have time to talk about. But we do a lot of art and science work. We just recently hosted a dance session that was inspired by a lot of our data visualizations, which was really fun. And yeah, we do a lot of this work with decision support dashboards and outreach. So I think that's all I have. And I'll stop sharing so we can all see each other.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you again, Kim. And I have no questions. No, I have a ton of questions for you both. I'm sure that folks here in the audience do as well. We're going to shift into the Q&A session. And so if you do have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And I guess to start, I wanted to ask a little bit about Matt, just to you, building on that presentation. As you were saying, there are so many dashboards out there, right? And so many tools out there. And when and how do you make a decision as to whether to even build a new one? Or how do you kind of bring that in? As you were saying, the water treatment plant managers are using a dashboard. So how do they also use yours? Or what step in the process does that happen?
Yeah, a few years ago, I gave a talk called Dashboards Are Dead. I hate dashboards, even though I make them. And I think the reason I don't like them is that I had previously been making them, again, with this arrogance of if you build it, they will come. And then I found if you build it, your friends will come, and maybe even 90% of your friends won't come. And so now with this project, I actually really like the dashboard, in part because they tell us what they care about and what they don't. And you constantly build stuff that no one needs. I think that's a huge problem in science. And I really like these ones now. So I won't build them. And essentially, I have moved from a sort of science-based approach where I'm interested in this, so I'll build it for myself, which I still do certainly internally for my group. But then to more of one, they're a client. Do they want this? Do they have a use for it? Can I investigate how much they're using it? We have tracking data on that app to see how they use it. What pages do they navigate to? And that's all just to help us inform to design it better. So I think that's one major thing. And then the other thing I'd say is I think the chatbot revolution has really highlighted that people really like natural language processing. So some of the more aggressive grants that we're pursuing is like, how do you blend these things? Most people really like to just be like, hey, what's the TOC going to be in 3 days? And then they get a thing rather than a dashboard, which is this, I think it's just an older way to think about visualization and sharing, is because you have to have a predefined set of questions an end user might have. But chatbots really allow us to have a lot of that stuff run on the fly. And so we're doing a lot more investigation of what is possible with these. And the hallucinations and making stuff up is much more manageable in a really small, where you're like, you can only say something if you saw it in this figure or in this data. So I'm excited about that. It's probably several years out, at least for my level of sophistication with these tools. But I think there's a lot of opportunities. And I would say I'm generally anti-dashboard creation, but I make them when a client wants them. I also think APIs, which are a public way to get the same data, are a much better use because actually everyone's sophisticated with data now, particularly with large language models and chatbots, making it so much easier for anyone to code. So we try to also make our data feed out so that anyone could use it in different settings. I think I answered at least some of your question.
100%, yeah. And Kim, I don't know if Kim, you want to weigh in on that question. I'm also just curious to hear your thoughts. And I know you also have to maybe leave us in a few minutes. So if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'm not a dashboard creator, but part of the work I'm doing is informing the development of dashboards. And I do want to point to some really successful efforts I've seen, but it points exactly to what Matt's saying, which is if you go and find out first what people actually want, then it's gonna have a better outcome and it's gonna be more usable and useful versus just saying, I have this great data and I want to put it out on a dashboard. And we're doing that now with that climate data set, that dynamically downscaled climate data set. Our efforts in outreach are designed towards seeing who even would use this and how would they use it and how can we make it so that they can easily manipulate the data to get the thresholds and the variables that they want for their specific decision. And the other effort I want to point to was Hyperfacets, which is a Department of Energy related endeavor, but they helped develop the CalAdapt dashboard, which is a climate adaptation focused dashboard for the state of California. And a lot of their work was like years of work talking with both climate modelers and water managers to see what was needed and how to line that up. And they created this really wonderful setup where they have visualization tools where folks that just kind of want to get some sense of what the future might look like for certain parameters around water or wildfire can go look at that. But then in the background are a bunch of notebooks and ways to pull in more the actual data to do more robust analysis. And yeah, I just love that example.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think from both of your presentations, I was really moved by just the importance of the local and in this work, connecting it to specific local sites. And that brought up for me, and I'll get to the questions from our attendees here in just a minute, but this question about scaling that local or how you think about scaling the work that you do and what terms and what challenges that might face. Maybe I'll throw that one to you first, Kim, if you want to think a little bit about responding to that.
Yeah, the scaling challenge is hard because it's a lot of it depends in terms of what people want and what people have the capacity. Yeah, Matt's nodding. Yeah, it's actually a real challenge, especially sitting in a national center. And then the one of the challenges, in addition to trying to scale, understand local context, but provide something that's broadly useful, the other piece that's really hard is the stakeholder burnout part. As we're seeing, especially in my space, in the sort of weather climate hazard space, as we're seeing increased variability and ramped up intensification of change, there's greater and greater demand for information about what changes we're going to see and how it's going to play out. And a lot of the same entities are getting requests for partnerships on projects over and over and over again. I remember talking to one large scale utility that was, you got to give me some sense of what's going to be involved here because I've done this a lot and I've said the same things a lot. And I think one of the things I'll say is that in the research space, we need to be, I think, really respectful of this and identify where we can, where information on needs has already been put out there. The other key point I've heard from practitioners is show up in our spaces, show up at our conferences. Don't ask us to come to new things. Don't ask us to answer new questions. Come to our spaces. And then boundary organizations. This is really critical. There's a lot of groups that are able to provide input on like a broader set of local contexts. They have the purview, but it takes some thoughtfulness and to get there. But that helps avoid the stakeholder burnout, and that also helps if you have trust with those boundary organizations, that helps a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, Matt, do you want to add onto that thought?
Yeah, Tal just put your post, and I was like, oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, I think I'm pretty anti the notion that scale works in this space. And I think a lot of the tech entrepreneurs that have moved into environmental space, they fail because they're so anti-consulting, because that's like a bad word in the tech world. But like fundamentally, environmental problems have a geography. And so you have to work in that geography. So you have to have local knowledge. And I think that what is interesting is when you have a new technologies, it is totally true that many of our partners do not know that there is different ways to do things. And so there's an education opportunity that's different from consulting, where the utility, in our case, Kim and I are talking about, one way to learn what they want is what are they paying for, which is RFPs that they put out, and they're like trying to pay a consulting firm to do X, Y, or Z. But when you see those, sometimes you can see in their own writing of their proposal call that they don't quite have the imagination of what's possible for the next phase. And so there's a lot of what my lab does is this quasi consulting stuff where we're like teaching them about what's possible. And then they're like, actually, we want to pay for that to do that here. And then we build that out. And I think the advantage we have is these technologies that move fast and go really quick, and we know about them and we can deploy them with the partners. But I just don't think that you can do a lot of this stuff in the way that so much of Silicon Valley is geared, where there's like a global solution and you just kind of plop it in. I actually think I haven't read your blog post, obviously, since I found out about 5 seconds ago. But you have to build that trust, and it's relational and it takes time. And I do think what Kim was talking about, where like these utilities are exhausted by a lot of stuff unless it's useful. And then they're stoked and they come to all the meetings and they bring all their friends. And it's like almost overwhelming as the scientist to be like, wait, I didn't invite all these people. And that's when you know you have something that's plausibly useful. And I do think they are also saying what they think is important by paying for it. They pay consultants to do a ton of this stuff. And I think that many of my friends have moved into consulting, I think in part because of the actionable science available there. That's happening. It's just happening in a way that's often then it's it's private. And Kim and I talked a little bit about open data. And that's one of the things I like about our work with Fort Collins is all of our code and data and everything is open. And that's Fort Collins taking a risk there because water quality data being public that they don't have to share is risky, but I love that they want to do that, to take that risk.
Did you coach them into taking that risk, or was that?
They were really game. I was always like, I'm open. I don't want to work on this if you're going to try to keep all of our stuff closed. And they're like, cool, whatever.
That's a really great orientation to enter into that partnership.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, commend you for that. So everybody's here to hear about AI and large language modeling in the conversation around data. And Tal, I'm going to get to your question first here in the chat. So Tal, you could unmute yourself, or I can read it if you want to.
Actually, I think it's Breeze's follow-up on my question that I think is the best one here with regards to AI. Basically, like, how are you thinking about LLMs when it comes to interpretability and also when it comes to hallucinations? How are you thinking about the data sets that are being integrated in these LLMs? And yeah, how do you ensure that data quality is high and authoritative?
I have a fantastic Juan. You saw him in one of those photos. My lab has meetings about AI like once a month because I'm always pushing more adoption, but trying to leave space for people who hate it. And Juan said, no one's making us ship bad product, which I liked because basically he's saying we can go faster. We just have to be more careful in the review. So we do use a lot of AI code and other things to build our dashboards and our analyses and all that. But we also have extra eyeballs on the outputs to deal with some of the hallucinations. And then I would say the open science part ties in directly here. We have a really high demand on our metadata commenting and our code commenting and all of that. And I think that gives us a really big opportunity because our custom written, hand drawn harmonizations and code from the pre-AI times is actually a really good way to get an AI on the right track when you're starting to work with it to code something new. So I've already done that a lot. Like that Aquasat database was just for the US, but recently I've been having projects that are global and I'm like, hey, I did all this here. Here's where all the data sources are and all these things that you can do with remote sensing in the United States because of the federal water quality portal and all these things. I want to do that in Europe. And it's like, all right, here's the API in Europe. Here's the way to do it. And so and then it copies my exact logic because my logic was so carefully laid out. But again, you can really minimize, mostly the answer to minimizing some of the hallucination is to pay for the highest tier because those models are better. But you can also minimize them by just looking and training your own session. So we do a lot of thinking about how to integrate this and how to be fair with it. And I have a broad range of staff that I think of it like IKEA versus a custom woodworker. Like IKEA is the AI-driven science revolution that we're going through, where like it's just like pounding it out and it has no sort of specific flavor. It's just efficient. And then there's the custom woodworker, which is like alone in a room, not touching AI and therefore potentially making more creative things because AI definitely like pushes towards, or at least many use cases, it pushes towards one answer. So we have a lot of discussions about it because there is tension in my group for sure across that range of like super early adopting and really reluctantly.
Kim, did you have anything to add to that question, or to add and build onto Reese's follow-up question about metadata, making your data findable? Yeah.
Most of the work I'm doing at the moment, despite my technical background, is qualitative and people-oriented. And I can say when I've tried to play with Gemini to help me summarize workshop transcripts and things like that. It's actually really awful. No matter how many prompts I give it to give me exactly the thing I want. So I'm old school in that way with my trying to get insights about some of these collaborative conversations and trying to synthesize that. In-car, on the whole, has a whole AI initiative that I am not part of. But I think some of the conversations that I've been part of related to AI, this being a national center is a different, and having models that underpin very critical operational models in terms of weather forecasting in the national water model and things like that. It's AI is a very useful tool and we're deploying it in any way that we can. We're always providing things openly and staying transparent. And so all of that is getting baked into how we think about AI moving forward. But I am definitely not the in-car expert on that. So that's all I'll say.
We have a question from Frank Miller. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, just 1 second. Brees, was that follow-up question responded to? Do you want to add anything to your question? Thanks for putting a question in the chat.
No, that's great. I'm sorry. I had to step away for just a second, so I missed a little bit of the response. But yeah, what I caught, that sounded great. Complicated issue.
Yeah, Dylan, if I can jump in.
Please go for it.
Yeah, I'm interested in decision making and under deep uncertainty in general. And the question that emerges with regards to the drought is possible duration for the current drought in the Southwest. And I'm curious about how you guys think about answering that question. What approach would you take if you were asked to answer that question? Thank you.
I have one relevant project that I immediately had to hire people who are better at this than me. So I'm speaking from a little bit of a place of ignorance because I'm a water quality expert, not a water quantity expert. But the project that we have is for the National Park Service, and they have had some of their parks' drinking water supplies run out because they depend primarily on shallow groundwater supplies. So in the Southwest, or really just the West, these shallow groundwater supplies in the past, there was just enough because A, visitors were lower, and B, it was maybe a wetter, cooler climate. And so we're doing these 50-year projections of risk for all of the water supplies in the country, because risk on the East Coast might be saltwater intrusion. So there's different forms of risk, but just the quantity risk, to answer your question, most of which with all these global climate simulation models is that in most cases, just because it's hotter, you have evaporative demand that's going to go up. And so even when what we do is we project an envelope of potential climate scenarios and we pick extremes and we say, all right, if you planned for the warm wet, which is one option for the West, or the hot dry, those are usually the extremes of the model. We can run models now that then model drinking water supply, resupply. And in almost all of that whole envelope, there's going to be less water. And there's going to be less water for a variety of reasons. Maybe there's just less total water, but a huge one that we know is going to happen and is already happening is the snow transition. So the notion that we have a lot of this snow coming. So I think in that case, it's one of those cases where the long-term uncertainty is actually lower because unless magically we have a climate change solution, we know that it's going to be hotter. And so the evaporative demand is going to be higher. And so we actually know we should be planning for less water over the long term. The specific question you ask is actually, I think, the hardest, right? So the near-term climate, what's happening in the next 5 years, I think that's probably you should just plan for the worst because that's what engineering teaches you to do, like a safety factor. But I think in this case, there's so many geopolitics and stuff that prevent that. Should we just I think the idea is there are bigger questions about Lake Powell and Lake Mead in the West of should we just shut down Lake Powell and give up on it because maybe nature is going to make that happen anyways as early as next year if there's more extreme drought. So I think that little time window you identified of like how long will this drought last? I think that's actually quite a bit harder. There's El Nino's setting up, so maybe it'll be a wet winter in the Southwest. There's just things that I think that window is actually the hardest. Whereas the long window, we kind of know a little bit more. And then the short window, of course, we know what's happening in the next 7 days.
Okay, I have a lot of thoughts here. I agree that the seasonal to interannual window is way harder. It's where everybody wants information right now, and from a predictability standpoint, it's very hard. But when we think about drought impacts, when we think about how drought plays out, there's been this long-standing orientation towards water supply, water availability, and there's been less emphasis on really bringing the policy and the economic drivers of water use into account. So there's two elements here. One, I think we need more focus on the full water budget beyond these watershed scales. I think it needs to be bigger because the drivers of water use and the where water ultimately goes, if you think about virtual water, is beyond the watershed scale. Two, we're going to be, because climate stationary is dead, right? Because we're going to see things that operations folks can't reference in their mind. Okay, this is a 2008 drought. This is going to be like that. This is going to be like a 2004 water year, which is a lot of this scenario storyline approach to figuring out how they're going to manage like reservoir releases and things like that. I think part of why I was inspired to put together the workshop that I talked about was because I think we're going to need actually closer partnerships between folks doing the fundamental science about predictability, hydroclimate predictability, and making those decisions because it's just gonna need to be a more iterative thing. And in addition to the science maybe getting better, there also is gonna need to be some changes, I think, in the way decisions are made. And I can't see how that moves fast without having kind of an ongoing conversation around the physical science and in partnership and in trust with the folks that are making the decisions. Because otherwise, it's like we're in our silos, right? We have the policy people talking about water allocation, and then we have the researchers talking about water availability. And it's like we need to do more talking across those. Yeah, that's my thoughts there. The modeling space is a lot. There are folks looking at aridification and predictability of some of these seasonal phenomena that drive the way the water year looks. And that's advancing, but I don't know that it's going to advance fast enough to avoid some of the water scarcity pieces we might run up against that are really like more anthropogenic drought than other things.
Good. Thank you both.
One thing just to add locally, the Cascaputa River, like many Western rivers, 80% of that goes to ag. And then there are subdivisions of where that water goes that I think like when drought hits, we should discuss more. Ethanol production from Western corn supply is insane to me because the water itself is so valuable, but we still use some percentage of what we grow here for ethanol, which there's a ton of newer. So that's an example of, do we need to build 5% more water storage to handle drought, or should we just cut out this 5% use case that's an odd, something that's been like we thought was environmentally friendly in the 80s and 90s, and now we're like, actually, this is terrible.
This starts to get in my mind into this sort of web of we allocate water at the state level, but there's a whole web of federal policies and global economic drivers that are pushing these things.
Yeah.
So it's even beyond the control of the folks that are managing water on those scales.
100%. That's what I guess I meant is I totally agree with you. The virtual water implications, where is the water actually going? What are we incentivizing? Why are we incentivizing it? That directly relates to Western drought handling. And I'm sure you all know about the alfalfa, and we ship a ton of it to Saudi Arabia. And there's all these weird decisions that we make that are under global economic pressures and state and federal incentives that I would say up until now exacerbate droughts. And maybe we could think about doing it the reverse way.
Yeah, such great points. Thank you both so much. And Frank, thanks for your question. Steve Young is on the call here. And Steve, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or I can ask. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, basically, I'm just interested I assume you all are doing some social media stuff as part of your overall programs, but I know we don't have much time, but if you could talk a little bit about what you're doing to leverage social media, anything creative, TikTok, influencers, whatever. Thanks.
And is that in influencing people adopt these tools and know how to use them? Or is it more about raising the profile of the science work? I'm just curious from...
Yeah, I'd say all of the above in terms of the question. Yeah.
And
And
I,
since we don't have that much time, I'm wondering if we can integrate that into Bree's second question here around integrating stakeholder perspectives that might be subjective. Oh, wait, how to say it? This one here. How you integrate stakeholders' perspectives that might be more subjective or informational or culturally sensitive. Just outreach and engagement, broadly speaking. If there's a way of doing it, just because we don't have a lot of time.
I think those two are really connected. So thank you for suggesting that.
I have to
Go ahead.
go
Kim.
there in one moment, so maybe can I go and then hop off?
Of course. Thank
And I'll try to touch on both of these, but this might be hard for me. I do want to say that I went to I was a participant in the American Meteorological Society Climate Policy Colloquium in December of 20, when was the last presidential election? It was like after the election results were known, but before we transitioned administrations. And there was a huge conversation with folks in that room about the role of scientists being communicators on social media platforms. I can say that in this particular year, with what INCAR has been through, everything that I do online is primarily on LinkedIn, and it's all in my personal vantage point, not representative of my institution. It's a tricky year for us. It's hard. We want to share our science. This is a challenging year. INCAR has a whole comms team, so they have their whole piece of getting that sort of information out. For integrating stakeholder perspectives into science-driven process, for me, this just lands in the actionable science space. The risk perception matters. Lived experiences matter. I'm part of a project that's helping to develop some compound hazard assessments for a large urban area where we're going in and we're doing workshops in collaboration with community organizations. So they're doing the outreach to their community members, and then we're going in and saying, what's your lived experience? And we're setting those up so that folks are with like-minded, or it's not, they're with folks that they have shared experience with. So we might have a group that's all Spanish speaking. We might have a group that's from this particular neighborhood and more of the youth population of that neighborhood. And what that informs is how we communicate the information, what is useful in that regard, what they care about, how the physical processes of extreme heat and air quality play out in their lives. So that's the sort of how of that is a little bit harder to unpack. It's a lot. It's intentional setup of these workshops, very intentional identification of patterns across different groups and how to incorporate that. But with that, I'm going to go. Matt, it was great to hear more about your work. Dylan and Tal, thank you so much for this opportunity. Thanks, y'all. It was lovely to be here. Dylan, you're muted.
I indeed am. Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you for being here and for staying on the call and for that answer. And back to, I think, Matt, you'll have kind of the last word here, and then we'll thank everyone for coming. So feel free
Yeah,
to.
thanks. This is an interesting question and tying to stakeholder. I want to have an impact, as I said earlier, and so I recognize that's one pathway. I also just like it's deeply not who I am, particularly after Twitter became what it is now. And so I don't do any of the thing that specific like social media, et cetera, but I actually have a comms staff member that does all of that for my lab. And to Bree's question, our work here is not at the scale of like watershed intervention or where like we're trying to get different community representatives. A lot of our work is just like we want this water treatment plant to work more functionally. However, because we're embedded in the community and we have all this public data, we do a lot of work on how people might perceive and use that data. So we've done a lot of that outreach and stakeholder engagement for public dashboards that are like, can you swim right now? What does this water quality parameter mean? And that actually follows directly into what Anika does, my comms person, which is basically like that's where the social media and all that comes in because that's one of the easier pathways. We also have a really cool, Kim mentioned she worked for the Colorado Water Conservation Board previously. We have a really cool project from them that is building data sonifications from our sensor data and then putting on like a poetry slash musical fest about the river. And we hope that brings in a lot of people that maybe came in not interested in turbidity, but then they're like, oh, that weird song you played was actually driven by these water quality parameters that I previously wasn't interested in, but now am. And so from that one, I would say that's much more of the traditional education where like we have knowledge and we want to share it, but we don't yet have projects where we're like going out into the community. I've been on proposals with that kind of thing where you're trying to integrate all community perspectives into an action plan, but we don't yet have ones that are like at that particular scale.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We are right at time here. We will follow up with an email with a video and a transcription of the talk, and we would love for you all to follow us, keep in touch, and let us know what you're working on and what you're up to. And for everyone who joined on the call, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate seeing you here in the room with us today. And there's obviously many more questions and more to be said on all of this. So we look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. And thank you again to Matthew Ross and Kimberly Fewless for joining us today. Keep in touch, and yeah, we'll hopefully.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
That was so fun.
Yeah, it's great.
Thanks,
Bye,
Matt.
everybody.